$2.1 trillion. That was the total global military spend in 2021. And if you have a look at the last 20 years, military spend has steadily increased, to a point where today we almost spend double of what was spent in year 2000. It is quite incredible that the US alone spent more than $800 billion, which amounts for more than a third of all military spending worldwide. China sits in second place, accounting for 14%, and India at third with 3.6%. The first EU country is France, in sixth place, who spent $57 billion, accounting for 2.7% of military spending, a fraction of what the United States or even China is responsible for. However, if the EU were to pool their resources together, would this make a difference? This video will address this question in three parts. Firstly, how would an EU army work? Secondly, how would an EU army compare to other world powers? And we'll look at both spending and at military equipment. And thirdly, will an EU army be a global superpower like the States or China? Currently, the EU member states are sovereign and determine their own laws in areas such as education, taxes, and defense. For an EU army to work, the EU would have to develop into a more federal model, where some powers, such as defense, are centralized on an EU-wide level. This means that the European Commission, the Parliament, or a new military entity would have control over the EU army and can decide when to deploy. This would allow the EU to have a unified response when it comes to conflicts, which is especially relevant now with Putin's war in Ukraine. This would also address the ineffective EU battle groups, which were formed in 2007 and have embarrassingly never been deployed. Furthermore, the EU can pool together resources in terms of infrastructure, military equipment, intelligence, and so on, therefore getting more out of every euro spent. Now, this is obviously a very complex topic, and there are many hurdles towards this actually happening. I am currently working on a video that will look into the types of models the EU can develop into. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified. Also, there are 2 videos on my channel with reasons for and against an EU army if you'd like more detail. Next, let's look at how powerful an EU army would actually be on the world stage, starting with military spend. Here's military spend per country for 2021, with France and Germany the only 2 EU countries in the top 10. The US and China have a bigger population, so it's not that surprising to see them so far ahead. But if we take the EU as a whole, it actually has more people than the US. So how does the EU compare in military spend? Let's have a look at the 27 EU countries, sorted by the amount they spend on their military. France, Germany, and Italy lead the pack. And if we scroll through all the 27 EU countries, we will find Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Malta at the bottom, which also makes sense as they are the smallest. Now, if we combine all of the EU countries together, this would result in $257 billion. This would move the EU to third place in the global spending list, not too far behind China, but still a long way behind the US. It gets really interesting when you sort by percentage of GDP spent on military, as Middle Eastern countries end up at the top of the list. The first EU country is Greece, with 3.48%. However, if we filter on EU countries again, you see that only 8 of them spend over 2%. And at the bottom, there are actually 4 European countries who spend less than 1%. Most EU countries are also part of NATO, where the military spending guideline is 2%, which may also be enforced for an EU army. Not to mention that 5 EU countries have already pledged to increase their defense spending to meet the 2% target set by NATO. So imagine if all the EU countries below the NATO threshold would increase their spending to 2%. Firstly, the top 8 would look rather different, with Germany moving into third place. Now let's combine all the EU countries together again. As you can see, the total spending now sits at $342 billion, putting the EU in second place, ahead of China, but still significantly behind the United States. Now there's one element that I've left out of the analysis so far, and that is purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity, or PPP, is an economic term for measuring prices at different locations. For instance, $1 million in China will get you more goods and services than $1 million in the States. For example, if we look at military personnel salaries, China will be able to employ more personnel for $1 million than the US. The same goes for equipment and operations. This is due to differences in living standards and currency. A study by Vox EU, linked in the description, determined a ratio specific to military spending and found that China can get 1.6 times more out of their military spending than the US. And for India and Russia, this is a whopping 3.4 and 3.2 respectively. Sadly, the data for the EU is incomplete, as Vox EU has only identified ratios for Germany, France, and Italy. For now, let's be somewhat conservative and take France's value and apply it to all EU countries. Now the picture looks quite different again. Sure, the US is still number 1 by a long way, but the EU drops down to 3rd, and India and Russia and South Korea all break the $100 billion mark. Obviously, military spend doesn't necessarily mean military might, and next we'll have a look at how the EU, US, and China compare in military equipment. Now, before you roast me in the comments, 2 quick points. Firstly, I know this is not the best comparison, and that there are many more factors when comparing military powers, such as the ones mentioned here. And secondly, the source I'm using is Global Firepower. Maybe not the most reliable, but it's the best I've found so far. But let's have a look nonetheless. Firstly, here are all the countries in the European Union. France is the only country with nuclear weapons, and also has the biggest air force and navy with more than 1,000 aircraft, 1 aircraft carrier, 10 destroyers, 11 frigates, and 10 submarines. It often goes unnoticed that Italy also has a considerable navy, with 2 aircraft carriers, and a 3rd likely to be commissioned this summer. As for tanks, Poland and Greece lead the pack, with over 2,000 tanks between them. Towards the bottom of the list there are Malta and Luxembourg, who only have a couple thousand soldiers, but they are also the smallest countries in the EU. Now let's combine all these numbers into an EU army and compare to the Chinese military. The numbers are quite similar, with China leading in active military personnel, submarines, and destroyers, and the EU leading in aircraft, aircraft carriers, and frigates. However, if we take the US into the picture, they are still clearly ahead, leading in every category except for frigates. But I don't think that matters when you have that many destroyers. Then compared to India, the EU leads in almost every category. And if we take Russia into the picture, they clearly lead the EU in terms of tanks and nuclear weapons, but less so on the sea. Lastly, there's the UK, who have an impressive military for their size, but fall short in all categories when compared to an EU army. Now, if we look at the most military numbers per category, the picture looks like this. So on to the last section of my video. Could an EU army rival the US or China? In terms of military spend and current military numbers, no. Definitely not the United States. As for China, the numbers are a lot closer, but due to many difficulties that come with creating an integrated EU army, it is unlikely to challenge China in the short term. Not to mention that the Chinese economy is still booming when compared to the EU. So, when we take nuclear weapons out of the equation, today's analysis would suggest that an EU army could come into 3rd place, as they spend more than Russia and India and also have more military equipment. However, there are so many challenges that come with an EU army. For example, what language will be spoken? And who's in charge? And what about all the different types of equipment? For instance, Europeans operate more than 11 different types of tanks. Imagine the enormous problems regarding maintenance, supply, and training. And what about member state sovereignty? And how will the military budget be determined? And what about public support? European leaders have expressed some interest, but there are many hurdles to overcome. More realistic is a defense union of the willing, where a select number of EU nations decide to enter into a military alliance. If you enjoy these types of videos, please subscribe and like the video, and let me know in the comments if you think an EU army is a good or bad idea.